My name is Joyce Adkins. I live close to Bowling Green, Kentucky, in a little town called Smiths Grove. And I'm going to speak to the issue of how voter ID laws disenfranchise older voters, because this is the first year in which Kentucky will have a voter ID law in place. So many people that were born in this country in the 1940s and the 1950s in the rural South were delivered by midwives who did not file a birth certificate. So that means that they can't get a driver's license, they cannot get ID, and not then register to vote. Photo ID laws hit older people, the poor, African Americans, and students the hardest. The older you get, the more likely that you won't have an ID. If you did have an ID, a lot of older people give up their driver's licenses and they don't replace that with a state issued ID. Well, you might say, well, they could if they wanted to, but that would mean they'd have to find a ride to the DMV or come up with the money for a bus or the metro. They might have to change buses or trains 3 or 4 times. Maybe they're on a walker or in a wheelchair, and it just gets more complicated from there. A lot of older people have lost their birth certificate several years ago, and it cost $55. Y'all, I was able to do that at that time, but there have been many, many years in my life when I couldn't even afford to pay my rent. So certainly I would not have been able to come up with $55 for a birth certificate, and I would have just been out of luck when it came to going to the polling place. Another thing that happens with older people, they may have changed their name through marriage or divorce, and especially in some states that can add a lot more complications. Also, we know more than a sixth or 18% of voters with disabilities reported difficulties voting in person in 2020. The older you get, the more likely it is that you're going to have a disability, and that includes a lot of people. But I'm just going to end up and say to our legislators, both our state legislators, which are mostly Republicans, and our federal legislators, which are all Republicans, no matter what your timeline is for voting on voting rights, legislation might be, for us older folks, the deadline is nothing short of victory. Thank you.
We welcome you to the launch of the Mass Poor People's Low Wage Assembly and Moral March on Washington, D.C., June 18, 2022.
And we need to do it with the biggest actions possible.
Because we know the only scarcity is the moral will to do what's right.
Veterans across this nation say enough is enough.
My voice is just as valuable as anyone else's.
We need the third Reconstruction.
We have an immoral system run by immoral people.
But together we fight.
And we become an agent of change.
We're rising up to demonstrate the compelling power that we, poor and low-income people, have to reconstruct society from the bottom up. It's time for a change!
We are people of resilience.